Doki Doki Literature Club is a great game, and I highly recommend you play it. It's one of my absolute favorite games, and it's free. So please, if you're interested in this game at all, go play it right now. It shouldn't take you too long to complete, because spoilers for the whole game are ahead. You've been warned. Ever since the 3rd grade, I've liked poetry, mostly because I had won a poetry contest the school held due to being the only person in my grade that could figure out how a haiku works. That being said though, I wouldn't call myself a professional poet or anything. I just think they're fun. So I really like getting to see the different writing styles we see from the members of the literature club. I'm not going to be going over every poem individually, but I'd like to examine the work the different girls produce. Now, everyone has a favorite, it's only natural, and personally, my favorite poet in the club is Natsuki. With her short, simplistic poems, I understand why she may not be many people's favorite. Her poems could easily come off as shallow or a bit try-hard, but I find them to be quite poignant. Her use of simple, almost childish vocabulary makes for a great juxtaposition with her actually quite mature pieces. She hides behind the facade of childishness to bluntly tell you exactly what she means to say. Amy Likes Spiders clearly takes the role of one of Natsuki's bullies, replacing Natsuki's passion for manga for something most find repulsive: spiders. Natsuki point-blank reveals how shallow and mean-spirited this stance is, to latch on to a single interest as a reason to hate someone. And even if one couldn't catch on to this double meaning, the message is still clear. Without knowing about Natsuki's manga collection, one can still easily grasp the message behind the work. All of Natsuki's poems are like this, where a thinly veiled metaphor states an important message to the audience. Personally, my favorite is Eagles Can Fly. I've seen plenty of people laugh at the poem for being just a list, but I think those people might be missing the point. Yes, it's a simple poem, and in fact it's the shortest you'll encounter in the first playthrough, but I find the message that people are, in a way, worthless, a really fascinating take. Being the poem that introduces the player to Natsuki, it amazingly lays out the girl's defeatist attitude. This poem tells the player that there's more to Natsuki than being the cute tsundere who likes to bake. It reveals the hidden depths of her character in a simple, elegant way. Something not quite as successfully done with Yuri. While Yuri may be my personal favorite member of the club, I really struggled to enjoy her poetry. While not poorly written by any means, I find Yuri's work to be style over substance. She slathers her writings with metaphor and analogy without ever actually managing to say anything with her high-level vernacular. Even with her overtly flowery language, her poems are downright more blunt than Natsuki's. It's not hard to deduce that she's writing about cutting herself in the raccoon, even without knowledge of further events to come. Yuri tries to rely on a mature voice for her poems, seeming to think that speaking in a disjointed, jerky cadence will make her words hit harder, which is unfortunate because I feel they tend to just come across as overdramatic. I feel her best work is Beach, as she has a much more broad topic to write about in this one. As most of her poems are, in short, I'm lonely and shy. Beach sees her tackle the much more complicated feeling of rejection from the player but a new friendship in Natsuki. Yuri seems a bit lost on how to feel during this poem, which allows her stunted wordplay to feel deserved. Her short use of sentences plays into that conflicted feeling of the writing. Were Yuri to write about more complex topics more often, I feel she could have been higher on my favorites list. A stance not dissimilar to how I feel about Sayori. I like Sayori's poems a lot when she actually tries. It's not too clear on whether or not Monika was already affecting Sayori for her first poem, but Dear Sunshine feels less like a poem about hidden depths about depression, and more like just a poem about the sunrise. Which, don't get me wrong, a poem can be about a sunrise and still be great. The problem really only arrives once we get to see Sayori's other poem. Bottles is one of my favorite poems in the game, utilizing the same thinly veiled metaphor tactic that Natsuki uses, but while expanding her writing. Sayori beautifully describes her pain as she recollects how her depression has manifested. Her analogy of happy thoughts in bottles getting shattered allows for more insight from the reader than we get out of her friends' poems. It's truly up to you to figure out what exactly she means by her wording, how exactly she got hurt. Quite frankly, Sayori's poems are the perfect mix of Natsuki's and Yuri's, utilizing the smart voice and meaning seen in Natsuki's work, while expanding the idea with more nuanced vocabulary like could be seen with Yuri. Honestly, if Sayori had gotten to write more poems, she could have been my favorite easily. What a shame that the girl who forced Sayori to quit the club early couldn't supply the player with poems that were just as good. The issues I have with Monika's poems are mostly the same as I have with Yuri's. While not quite as heavy-handed in her wordplay, Monika is using a lot of words to say very little. The lady who knows everything broaches Monika's nihilism without the same level of nuance as had been seen in Sayori's bottles. Monika likes to put an emphasis on describing actions in her work, meaning you tend to just wait around for the last couple of lines where she finally just tells you what she wants to say. Beyond that, her poems don't ever get to stray away from her realizing she's in a video game. Each piece is just another step in her struggles to win your heart. Fascinatingly, the only one in the game who is sentient is also the one who has the least character. Though I would be remiss to not mention that Monika's poems use the space of the page the most interestingly. Long poems that force you to scroll all the way back to the top to reread a line. Her words tend to travel across the page, giving them an energy more similar to art than writing. I wish I liked Monika's poems more than I do, and perhaps if she had gotten the chance to write about her hobbies or interests, I would have. But since Monika does have the tendency to fool around with the game, that means we get a load of fascinating secret poems. The special poems are sporadically given throughout the second playthrough. You will receive 3 of the 11 poems in a run, and I find these to be fascinating. They aren't explicitly written by any given girl, meaning it's up to you to figure out who wrote each poem. So let's take a look at these special pieces. Happy Thoughts is one I feel like most people get, and it's certainly one of the most memorable of the bunch. Technically a poem, it mostly features a crude illustration of Sayori's suicide. This may be written by Sayori in the throes of the corruption dealt by Monika. Perhaps she'd hoped writing about it would be enough to satisfy the code telling her to kill herself. Or maybe this was made by Monika, a sort of visual to accompany the manipulation Monika set upon the player's childhood friend. Either way, I think an important thing to note is how calmly it looks drawn. Like, the lines are really even and smooth. They don't wibble around, they aren't composed of many little strokes. This looks to have been made with confidence, implying to me that this is more likely to be Monika's work. Can You Hear Me and Special Poem 7 are both clearly Monika trying to present herself to you outside of the normal gameplay, reaching out with her common phrase and seemingly trying to load her sprite into the poem section. Similarly, Stare at the Dots seems to be Monika using a more conventional approach. She doesn't want you to be scared of her, so she's not trying to frighten you like how she does with Yuri. Not to mention the fact that Monika has access to the code, so she's able to make a poem that changes over time to say I love you, means she's the only one who could make this. But this is where things start to get more interesting. This poem that is almost entirely redacted reads, "Nothing is real?" Curiously, this is presented as a question, not a statement. This poem can be altered to see the redacted words, though. It seems to be an excerpt of a story, featuring some characters not seen in the game. I believe this is from the book Yuri's reading throughout the game, Portrait of Markov. The fact that the poem is talking about how nothing is real at first led me to think that this was Monika, as she tends to grapple with the real and not real dynamics of being stuck in the game, but being able to see the rest of the words makes me think this is from Yuri. Yuri's description for the book changes pretty drastically in the second act, implying Monika's using it to mess up Yuri as much as she's directly affecting her code. Compounded with the horrific poems Yuri starts to write, it's as if she's being made to think the events of Portrait of Markov are real events happening to her. This question of nothing is real could be Yuri asking if none of the horrors she writes about are real, or that none of the quiet life in the club is real anymore as she sinks into madness. There's another poem with something that's been redacted, this one of the author detailing cutting themselves. When I first saw this poem, I assumed Yuri had written it, that she was describing doing it for the first time, and that the redacted section was the word love or something similar. However, it turns out that the redacted word is Yuri, meaning I think it's pretty clear that this is Monika trying out her friend's hobby. We'll call it a hobby. Now, not all the special poems are so up in the air as to who wrote them. Things I Like About Papa is pretty clearly by Natsuki, detailing how, as Monika messes with her code, her father gets steadily worse and worse. Not only is Natsuki the only one who even has a family member mentioned throughout gameplay, but his abuse is talked about explicitly throughout the second act. And beyond all that, the poem follows Natsuki's simplistic writing style. Similarly, special poem 10 seems to be from Sayori, discussing the therapy she'd be getting due to her depression. It even echoes the happiness seen in her Bottles poem. Side note, I really like this one. It just really perfectly describes the mindset one can have about depression and how they feel they are doing at handling it, and the fact that it bleeds off the side of the page is really cool, implying that Sayori didn't quite want to put the idea of going to the emergency room into words, so as to not admit that she'd have to hurt herself severely enough to prompt that. Really solid poem. There are 3 poems I'm not too sure about though. They're all formatted the same, which could mean they're written by the same person, but I feel they have different voices between the 3. A joke, a dream, and then another one titled A Dream. They seem connected not only because 2 are titled the same way, but because one of the dreams mentions a joke being told. I think by focusing on the different voices used for the writing and how the dreams and jokes interact across the poems, we can figure out who wrote them. Now, one of the dreams clearly follows Yuri's voice, overtly descriptive, lots of short sentences for impact. The events of the poem even seem similar to one of her poems from the second act, Wheel. However, the other dream poem doesn't follow this voice and honestly sounds a lot more like Natsuki's writing, simpler lines and vocabulary, which means these poems almost echo the beach poems the 2 write for each other if you pursue Sayori in the first route. Natsuki's dream discusses a sleepover where, in her dream, an unknown person says a joke, which happens to time up with her friends laughing perfectly when she wakes up. When she sleeps, the walls become covered in bloody nails. It seems the friends dream about how Monika corrupts their code to make them less desirable. Yuri dreams of her book, Portrait of Markov. Natsuki dreams of how her home life has become physically abusive due to her father. In Natsuki's dream, she wonders how the 5th person knew to say the joke at just the right time. She mentions that there are 4 people attending the sleepover, and then a 5th, unknown person joins in. It's not out of the question to think that the 4 people are the girls in the club, with the 5th one being the player, a literal unknown beyond the game screen. Does that mean Natsuki can see the player in her dream? Perhaps, but it doesn't make sense for the player to make a joke. I think rather that the 4 people attending the sleepover are Natsuki, Monika, Yuri, and the protagonist you play as, and that the 5th person is Sayori. Natsuki wouldn't be able to recognize her since Sayori's been deleted. Perhaps in the dream Sayori knew to tell her joke at that time because the girls are still following the script. That perhaps originally Sayori was meant to say a joke and have everyone laugh, but is now no longer able to do that. She still tells the joke, and the club members are still programmed to laugh, but have been rewritten to laugh at the TV due to Sayori's absence. Which stands to reason that the poem titled A Joke is from Sayori, writing about her mental state after succumbing to the manipulation from Monika, after becoming aware enough to see that she's been reprogrammed. Or perhaps it was Monika who wrote the joke, as it mentions programming and script, favorite topics for the club leader to write about, and the only one who would reasonably use such devices as metaphor. Maybe it's a bit of both, Monika writing for Sayori. This one is definitely the hardest to crack for me. But that's what makes games like DDLC fun, right? Trying to unravel the mystery is cool. I know some of you are going to leave comments before finishing the video talking about Project Libitina. Yeah, I watched that game theory video a million years ago too, but I'm not interested in trying to find hints about a game's plot that isn't even out yet. I wanted to make this video to examine the actual literature found in the club and discuss my thoughts about it. I don't care about Project Libitina, so don't expect me to read your comments about it. I just wanted to talk about poetry, and I hope you had fun exploring the literature club with me. Let me know who you think wrote the A Joke poem. Also, you get bonus points if you make a poem out of your comment. Hey, just wanted to give a huge shout out to my patrons. You're all super amazing. Don't forget that I've got merch as well. That's fun and exciting, and you can find a link to that in the description. And yeah, don't be afraid to let me know what your favorite poems are from the game. I know I kind of went in hard on Monika, especially her, the woman who knows everything poem. And that's okay if you disagree with my opinions. Like, my best friend, that is her favorite poem, is the one I used as, like, the primary example of why I don't like Monika's writing. So yeah, nothing wrong with people having different opinions. Don't be afraid to share, and like I said, if your comment is a poem, you get bonus internet points. and I'll like you a lot. So yeah, don't be afraid to get creative and let me know what you think about the literature found here at the club.